The morning the Belties came was a Tuesday, at the end of October. The year was 2003. I remember the air had that particular damp chill to it, the kind that promises a hard frost is only a week or two off, but isn't quite there yet. The sky was the colour of old tin, and a low fog was settled in the hollows, making the world feel smaller than it was. I was standing by the gate to the north pasture, the one nobody'd run anything on in 30 years, when I heard the grind of a heavy truck coming down the county road, gearing down for the turn into my lane. It was early, not yet 7, and the sound was an intrusion on the quiet. I had a thermos of coffee in my hand, steam rising up and disappearing into the grey, and I took a slow sip. I knew who it was. A hauler out of West Missouri, a man I'd spoken to once on the phone, a deal made on a handshake I'd never actually given him. 50 head of belted Galloways, culls from a bigger operation that was switching over to Angus for the feedlot contracts. The owner had wanted them gone before he had to start feeding them hay for the winter. It called them inefficient foragers, lawn ornaments, a novelty breed that didn't pencil out. I got them for not much more than the cost of the hauling, a price so low it felt like a secret. The truck, a long silver pot with dust from 3 states on it, backed up to my loading ramp with a sigh of its air brakes. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, got out and didn't say much. He just handed me the paperwork, a bill of sale that might as well have been a receipt for a bad idea. We dropped the ramp and the cattle started to come out, hesitant at first, then in a dark, shaggy tumble. They were just as the man had described, smaller than a Hereford, blocky and thick, covered in long black hair with that distinctive white band around their middles. They looked like Oreo cookies someone had left out in the rain. They weren't beautiful in the way a show animal is beautiful. They were rugged, their coats coarse and matted in places. They looked like they belonged on a Scottish moor, not in the rolling hills of the Ozarks. They milled around the holding pen, their breath pluming in the cold air, their dark eyes taking in the new place with a deep, unsettling calm. They didn't bawl or push the fences, they just watched. My wife, Sarah, had asked me the night before what I was doing, not in an accusatory way, just a plain question. How many acres are we talking about? I told her the deed for the North Quarter was for 120 acres, the part we could see, the part that wasn't choked with 30 years of cedar, sumac and wild rose, was maybe 80. The rest was a tangled mess, land that had been let go when my grandfather got too old to fight it, and my father had his hands full with the bottomland row crops. What are you doing with 50 cows, even small ones, on 80 acres of overgrown pasture? She'd asked. I told her I was farming. She just nodded and went back to her book. She'd learned long ago that some of my reasons take a while to surface. The hauler was ready to go. He looked at the cattle, then at the wall of brush that started 100 yards from the barn. He looked at me. Good luck with him, he said, and it wasn't a wish. It was a judgment. He climbed back in his cab, fired up the diesel, and was gone, leaving me alone with 50 head of what the smart money called a mistake. I opened the gate to the north pasture. The cattle moved slowly, sniffing the air, and then, as one, they walked through. They didn't run. They just walked, disappearing into the tall, dormant grass and the edge of the brush line like they were being swallowed by it. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet return, broken only by the sound of their steady, methodical grazing. I didn't know yet what they knew. I didn't understand that I hadn't bought 50 head of cattle. I had hired 50 surveyors, 50 historians, 50 dowsers who worked for grass in a salt block. The ground remembers what it was meant to be, my grandfather used to say, and I was banking on the idea that an animal's hunger is a better map than a surveyor's string. The morning was still gray and quiet, but for the first time in a long time, that forgotten piece of ground felt like it had a purpose again, even if I was the only one who thought so. And that purpose was about to unearth a secret that had been sleeping for half a century, buried under nothing more than neglect and the slow, patient creep of the wild. It was a secret worth more than all the cattle, more than the farm itself. It was a piece of the past, waiting. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I hadn't just bought coals, I'd taken on sick animals. It wasn't 50 head. It was closer to 100. I wasn't putting them on the scrub pasture. I was turning them loose to starve. Small town gossip is its own kind of weather system, and I was in the middle of a low pressure zone. The real confirmation that I'd done something foolish in the eyes of my neighbors came around 4 that afternoon. Dale's truck pulled up. You could always tell it was Dale's truck because it was a 3-year-old Ram 3500 that still looked like it was on the showroom floor. He farmed 2 sections down the road from me, all cash-rented ground, all corn and beans, all done by the book. The book, in his case, being the latest recommendations from the university extension. He idled by my fence, the diesel a low rumble, and rolled down his passenger side window. He didn't get out. Dale rarely got his boots dirty if he could help it. "Heard you got some new lawn ornaments," he said. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who knows he's right about something. I was leaning against a fence post, just watching the spot where the Galloways had disappeared. I could hear them in the brush, the steady tearing of grass and leaves. "Something like that," I said. He gestured with his chin toward the north pasture. "Gonna take a lot of hay to get that bunch through the winter. That ground's not much. Been fallow since your granddad's time." He said fallow like it was a disease. To Dale, land that wasn't producing a cash crop was a liability. "They're foragers," I said. "They're made for this kind of ground." Dale chuckled. It was a soft, dismissive sound. "Everything's a forager until the first snow sticks. Then everything's a liability. What are you doing with 50 fat ducks on 40 acres of standing water?" That's what my dad would have said. "You're trying to feed 50 head on 80 acres of weeds and rocks. The numbers don't work. You know that." He was being polite, not cruel. He was certain. His world was made of certainties. Bushels per acre, cost per unit, rate of return. My world was made of hunches and memories, things that didn't fit on a spreadsheet. "I'll keep an eye on 'em," I said. "You do that," he said, the smile fixed in place. "Don't want the county calling you about animal neglect come February." He gave a little wave, rolled up his window and drove off, his clean tires kicking up a little puff of dust. I stood there for a while after he left. He wasn't wrong, by his lights. Every piece of conventional wisdom said I was on a fool's errand. 2 days later, the modern expert arrived. This one came in a sensible county sedan. A young man from the extension office, clipboard in hand, clean Carhartt jacket zipped up to his chin. He said he was just in the area and heard I'd acquired some new stock, wanted to offer his services. I knew Dale had called him. It was a well-meaning ambush. We stood there, in the same spot I'd stood with Dale, and he laid out the numbers. "So, 50 head," he started, looking at his sheet. "Mature belted Galloway cows. You're looking at about 1,100 pounds. So you've got 55,000 pounds of live weight out there. A cow will eat about 2.5% of her body weight in dry matter per day. So you're looking at needing close to 1,400 pounds of dry matter every single day." He looked up from his clipboard, his expression earnest and concerned. "Now, this pasture," he said, waving a hand at the overgrown expanse, "at best, you might get 800 pounds of usable forage per acre, and the quality is going to be low. On your 80 usable acres, you've got 64,000 pounds of forage for the whole season. Your 50 cows will eat that in about 45 days. You let the numbers hang in the air. So, by mid-December, you're out of feed. And hay prices are projected to be over 150 a tonne this winter. You're going to need, let's see." He scribbled on his clipboard. "At least 2 tonnes of hay per head to get them through to spring grass. That's 100 tonnes of hay. That's $15,000, give or take. On cattle, you probably can't sell for 20. He looked at me, his face a mask of helpful pity. He was quoting a number designed to end the conversation. "I appreciate you running the figures," I said. "Just want you to go in with your eyes open," he said. We're here to help farmers stay profitable. I nodded. I'll be sure to call if I need a hay supplier. He gave me a folder full of pamphlets on rotational grazing and winter feed supplementation, got back in his sedan and drove away. The world was full of people who had the numbers, who were certain, and all their numbers said the same thing. I was wrong. I was being sentimental. I was farming with my heart, not my head. And that night, lying in bed, listening to the wind pick up, I'll own that I felt a flicker of doubt. $15,000 was a lot of money to lose on a hunch. But then I thought about my grandfather and the thing he'd said, standing on this very piece of ground 40 years earlier. That was the reason I was doing this. Not sentiment. It was a debt to a piece of forgotten knowledge. I was maybe 10 years old, and it was a hot summer afternoon. My grandfather had taken me for a walk, which wasn't unusual. He was a man who preferred to think on his feet. He was in his late 60s then, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, but still strong. He didn't walk fast, but he walked with a purpose, and I had to hustle to keep up. We weren't going anywhere in particular, just walking the fence line of the North Quarter. Back then, the brush was already thick, but it hadn't completely swallowed the land yet. You could still see the bones of the pasture beneath it. We stopped on the little rise that overlooks the creek bed, the same spot where I'd stood watching Dale's truck disappear. Grandfather pointed with his chin, the same way Dale had, but his meaning was different. "You see all this?" he said, his voice raspy from the summer dust. He was looking at the tangle of cedar and sumac. "Most folks look at this and see a problem. They see work. They see land that's gone back to wild." I nodded. That's what I saw too. A place you couldn't drive a tractor through. A place where you'd lose a calf if you weren't careful. "They're not wrong," he continued, "but they're not right either. They're looking at what it is. They're not looking at what it was, or what it wants to be again." He knelt down, his old knees cracking, and pushed aside a clump of fescue. He dug his fingers into the dirt. It was dark and rich, even on the high ground. "This is good ground," he said, rubbing the soil between his thumb and forefinger. "Black ground. Holds water. My father, your great-grandfather, he ran 100 head of shorthorns on this quarter. 100 head. And they came out fat every fall." I looked around. It seemed impossible. The 80 acres I could see wouldn't support 30 head, let alone 100. "But where did they all fit?" I asked. He smiled a little, a sad, distant smile. He looked toward the thickest part of the brush, down toward the northwest corner where the creek made a sharp bend. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said. He stood up, groaning a little. "People forget, fences fall down, brush grows up. A generation goes by and what was known becomes a story. Another generation, and the story becomes a guess." We stood there in silence for a minute, just listening to the cicadas buzz. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. "What's forgotten ain't gone," he said. "It's just waiting. You listen close enough, the land will tell you its secrets. The animals, they hear it better than we do. They remember." That was it. He never explained what he meant about the 100 head or the size of the pasture. We just walked back to the house, but the words stuck with me. What's forgotten ain't gone. It's just waiting. For years, it was just a memory, a piece of grandfatherly wisdom. But when I took over the farm from my father and the deed to that North Quarter passed to me, the memory started to feel more like a map. The deed was clear. Lot 4 of the Northwest Quarter, Section 18, Township 25 North, Range 15 West, containing 121.5 acres, more or less. The plat map from the county courthouse confirmed it, 121.5 acres. But the fences, the ones that were still standing, enclosed barely 80. For years I'd just accepted it. The other 40 acres were part of that impenetrable brush, useless, inaccessible,
a rounding error in the messy accounting of a family farm. But my grandfather's words kept nagging at me. He wasn't a man for tall tales. If he said his father ran 100 head, he believed it. And you can't run 100 head on 80 acres of Ozark pasture, no matter how good it is. Not without breaking the bank on feed. So when the chance to buy the Belties came up, it felt like a key turning in a lock. Here was a breed of cattle famous for one thing, their ability to thrive on rough forage, to push into places other cattle wouldn't go. They weren't just cows. They were a tool, a way to ask the land the question my grandfather had left hanging in the air. I wasn't just trying to feed 50 cows on 80 acres of weeds. I was betting the farm, almost literally, that there were another 40 acres hiding in plain sight. I was betting that what was forgotten wasn't gone.
And I was betting that a herd of hungry, shaggy cattle could read a map that was invisible to the human eye. It was a long shot, a faith-based kind of farming, but my grandfather had taught me that sometimes the only numbers that matter are the ones that don't add up. The day after the man from the extension office left, I decided it was time to stop guessing and start looking for the book. My father had passed 10 years earlier, and my grandfather long before that. When we cleaned out the old farmhouse, most of what was left was dust and memories, but my father had saved a few of my grandfather's things in a heavy wooden crate he kept on a high shelf in the machine shed. I hadn't opened it in years. I got a stepladder and wrestled the crate down. It was covered in a thick layer of grime, and the wood smelled of oil and damp earth. I pried open the lid. Inside, nestled amongst old tools with hand-carved handles and a few tarnished medals from the Great War, were the notebooks. 3 of them. They were standard-issue marbled composition books, the kind you could buy at any general store for a dime. The covers were soft and frayed at the corners. The pages were yellowed, filled with my grandfather's neat, careful cursive, written in pencil that had gone brown with age. He was a man of few words, but he was a meticulous record keeper. These books were the history of the farm, written in a language of numbers and observations. I took them back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Sarah was out for the afternoon, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock. I opened the first one. The inside cover said, John T. Reynolds, 1948. The entries were terse, methodical. April 12th, 1949. Planted corn in the bottom 40. Soil dry. Sky clear. July 2nd, 1951. Hay in the barn. 2,100 square bales off the south 60. Good yield. Rain held off. November 5th, 1955. Sold 20 steers. Averaged 950 pounds. Price was 22 cents. Paid off the note on the tractor. It was a life, recorded in small, concrete details. I spent an hour just reading, feeling the rhythm of the seasons, the worries about weather and markets, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. He recorded fence repairs, calving dates, the cost of a new ploughshare. He noted the first frost of every year, the day the martins returned in the spring. Then I found what I was looking for. It was in the second book, dated 1962. He would have been in his late 50s then, my father just a young man. The page was dated August 20th, 1962. He'd been repairing fence on the North Quarter. Walked the North Line today. Fences down in 20 places along the creek. Cedars coming in thick. Hard to follow the old wire. Then, a few lines down, there was a different kind of entry. It wasn't about a repair or a yield. It was a question, written with a heavier pencil stroke, the words slightly larger than the rest. I leaned closer to the page. Deed says 121.5 acres for the northwest quarter. Fence line as it stands today is maybe 80 acres, if that. Can't find the corner marker from the 28 survey down by the creek bend. Post should be there. Did Dad move the fence? Or did the creek jump its bank in the 45 flood?
and we just let the brush take it. And then, underlined twice, was the key. Lost 40 acres. The entry ended with a small, hesitant question mark, as if he was afraid to even write the thought down. There it was. Not a memory, not a story, but a hard piece of data, written in his own hand. He had seen it too. The discrepancy.
The missing land. He had asked the same question that had been nagging at me for years, but he was older, tired. My father was focused on the more profitable row crops. The world was changing. Combines were getting bigger, farms were consolidating, and fighting 40 acres of brush for marginal pasture land probably felt like a losing battle. So the question was never answered. The notebook was put away. The brush grew thicker. The fence line was forgotten, and the 40 acres, if they existed, went to sleep. I closed the notebook and just sat there for a long time. The doubt I'd felt after Dale and the extension agent visited was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This wasn't a hunch anymore. It was an investigation. My grandfather had left me a map and a question, and outside in the grey autumn light, I had 50 head of cattle that were already starting to answer it. I put the notebook back in the crate, carefully, like it was scripture. I wasn't ready to tell Sarah yet. This was a conversation you only have once, and I needed more than a penciled question from 1962. I needed to put my boots on the ground. I needed to see what the Belties had found. What's forgotten ain't gone. It's just waiting. And I finally had the feeling that I knew where to look. The next morning I was out before 5. The air was sharp, and for the first time that fall, the frost was hard on the ground, a silver crust over everything. I filled my thermos and headed for the North Quarter. I didn't go in with a plan, not exactly. My only plan was to watch. For the next 3 weeks, that's what I did. I made a habit of it. Every morning and again every evening, I'd walk the perimeter of the 80 acres, just observing. The Belties had established their patterns. They were creatures of habit and deep instinct. They'd carved paths through the tall grass and the thinner sections of brush, trails that were becoming more defined every day. What was interesting was where they spent their time. They grazed the open 80 acres, sure, but they didn't linger there. They treated it like a hallway. Their destination was always the brush line, that thick, tangled wall of cedar, locust and wild rose that marked the boundary of the known world. They would spend hours in there, and I could hear them moving, the crackle of branches and the steady, relentless sound of their grazing. They were supposed to be getting thinner. The extension agent's numbers said they should be losing condition, hungry for the hay I wasn't giving them. But when I'd see them emerge from the brush in the evening, heading for the water tank, they were calm. Their coats were thick and healthy. Their bellies were full. They weren't just surviving in that thicket, they were thriving. After a month, a clear pattern had emerged. They weren't using all of the brush. They were concentrating their efforts on a specific section, the northwest corner of the property, the same area my grandfather had mentioned in his notebook, down near the bend in the creek. They had pushed a wide, arching path into the densest part of the woods, a path that didn't follow the gentle contour of the land, but cut straight into its deepest part. From the rise where I liked to stand, it looked like a dark river flowing into a sea of green and brown. They were telling me something. They weren't just eating, they were searching. An animal's hunger is a map. I decided it was time to follow it. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, I put on my heaviest canvas jacket, a pair of leather gloves, and took a pair of loppers and a small handsaw. I found the main trail the cattle had made and followed it into the brush. It was like entering another world. The air was still and damp, and the light was filtered through a thick canopy of cedar branches. The ground underfoot was a soft mat of old leaves and cedar needles. The Belties had done more than just make a path. They'd eaten everything they could reach. They had stripped the lower branches off the cedars, eaten the wild rose bushes down to thorny nubs, and cleared out all the undergrowth. It was like a park in here, a strange, manicured forest. I followed their trail deeper. It was easy walking. The path was a good 6 feet wide in places. I walked for what felt like a quarter of a mile, the trail heading steadily northwest. The sounds of the road and the farm faded away, replaced by the silence of the woods. Then I saw it. To the left of the path, almost completely swallowed by the roots of a massive oak tree, was a cedar post. It was old, the wood gray and weathered to iron. It was tilted at a drunken angle, but it was unmistakable. A fence post. It was a good 50 yards west of the existing fence line, the one I'd always thought was the boundary. My heart started beating a little faster. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the ground now, looking for more signs. The cattle trail continued its straight, deliberate line. Another 100 yards on, I found a second post. This one rotted almost to the ground, but the telltale strand of rusted barbed wire was still stapled to it, buried deep in the wood. This was a fence line, an old one that nobody had seen in 50 years. I followed the line, post by post. Some were gone, completely returned to the earth, but the cattle knew. Their trail didn't waver. It followed the ghost of that fence as if the wire were still strung tight. The line ran straight for nearly half a mile, deep into the property, then made a sharp 90-degree turn to the north. I was in the corner my grandfather had written about. I stood at the turn and the spot where a corner post should have been and looked around. The brush was thinner here. The soil under my feet felt different, spongier, darker. I had brought a soil probe with me, a simple T-handled steel rod. I pushed it into the ground. On the other side of the phantom fence line, the side I'd always known, the probe went down about 6 inches before hitting clay and rock, standard Ozark upland. But here, on this side, the side the cattle had led me to, the probe slid down. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. It slid almost the entire length of the rod before it stopped. I pulled it out. The core it brought up was beautiful. It was black, not brown, but a deep, rich, crumbly black, laced with organic matter. It smelled sweet and earthy. It was bottomland soil, black gold. I was standing on a piece of lost ground, a piece of the rich creek bottom that had been cut off and forgotten. The creek must have changed course, as my grandfather suspected, and the fence was never moved to follow it. The brush grew up, and 40 acres of the best land on the farm simply vanished from the working map. It was still on the deed, still on the plat, but it was gone from memory. The tile was there, the cattle had found it. They hadn't been drawn in by the scrubby cedars. They had been drawn by the rich grasses and forbs that grew in this forgotten pocket of black soil, forage that was far more nutritious than anything on the upland pasture. They hadn't been surviving. They had been feasting. I stood there in the quiet woods with the black soil on my hands, and I finally understood. What's forgotten ain't gone. It's just waiting. And my 50 head of ugly, uneconomical cull cattle had just handed me the key to a kingdom I never knew I'd lost. The work was just beginning, but the investigation was over. The question mark my grandfather had put in his notebook in 1962 finally had an answer. Finding the land was one thing, proving it was another. A rotted fence post and a hunch wouldn't be enough to get the county to recognize a new boundary for tax purposes, or to secure a loan against the land's true value, if I ever needed to. I needed something official. I needed an expert. But I didn't want the young man with the clipboard and the formulas. I needed a different kind of expert. One who understood that the oldest maps aren't always printed on paper. I remembered a name from my father's time, Abernathy. Old Man Abernathy. He had been the county surveyor for what felt like 100 years. People said he'd walked every property line in 3 counties. He was long since retired, but word was he still went into the records office at the courthouse once a week. mostly just to keep his hand in and make sure the young folks weren't messing things up too badly. The following Tuesday, I drove into town. The courthouse is an old stone building with tall windows and floors that creak with history. I found the assessor's office in the basement. It smelled of old paper and dust. A young woman at the counter asked if she could help me, and I asked if Mr. Abernathy was around. She smiled. "He's in the back. Let me see if he's available." She disappeared behind a tall wall of filing cabinets. A minute later, a man emerged. He was stooped and thin, with a shock of white hair and glasses thick enough to be goggles. He wore a crisply ironed plaid shirt and trousers held up by suspenders. He moved slowly, deliberately. This was the quiet, validating expert I was looking for. "I'm Abernathy," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "What can I do for you?" I introduced myself and told him my family name. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Reynolds, north of town. Your grandfather was John, a good man. Had a disagreement with him once about a line fence in 58. He was right, I was wrong. One of the few times." I told him I had a question about that same property, the North Quarter. I explained what my grandfather had written in his notebook and what I'd found by following the cattle. I didn't embellish, I just laid out the facts. The deed for 121.5 acres, the existing fence enclosing only 80, the line of old posts, the change in the soil. I had made a rough sketch on a piece of graph paper, marking where I'd found the posts and the corner. He listened without interrupting, his head tilted slightly, his eyes unreadable behind the thick lenses. When I was done, he was silent for a long moment. He just stood there, looking at my crude drawing. "A lot of people come in here with stories," he said finally. "They think they've found a lost gold mine or a buried treasure. 99 times out of 100, they've just misread their deed." He took my sketch. "Come on," he said, turning and shuffling toward a massive, flat-file map cabinet in the corner. "Let's look at the old plat." He pulled open a wide, shallow drawer with a loud metallic scrape. The drawer was filled with huge, rolled-up linen maps. He selected one, his bony fingers seeming to know exactly which one to grab. He carried it over to a large, dusty table and carefully unrolled it. It was the original survey map for our township, dated 1928. The lines were drawn in India ink, the lettering elegant and precise. He smoothed it out with his hands. "All right, Reynolds, section 18. His finger, crooked with arthritis, traced the lines on the old map. He found my quarter section. He peered at it, his nose almost touching the linen. Then he looked at my sketch, then back at the map. He went silent again. This was the moment, the expert who goes quiet. The silence stretched. It wasn't an empty silence. It was the silence of a man processing decades of knowledge, comparing a modern-day sketch to a 75-year-old document, cross-referencing it with the memory of a conversation from 1958. The young woman at the counter was watching us. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Finally, he tapped a single spot on the old map with his finger. It was the northwest corner, right where the creek was drawn, with a series of wavy blue lines. "There's the marker," he said softly. "Iron pin set in 28. Your grandfather and I looked for it. Couldn't find it. The creek had washed out the bank. We assumed the pin was gone, washed downstream." He looked at my sketch again, at the X I'd drawn to mark the corner I'd found. "You say the cattle path made a hard turn there?" "A perfect 90-degree turn," I said. "And the soil changes right on that line." He nodded slowly. "The 45 flood," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "It was a bad one. The creek cut a new channel, 100 yards east of the old one. Created a kind of oxbow. Over time, that old channel would have silted in. The brush would have taken it." He was no longer talking to me. He was talking to the map, to the ghost of my grandfather. He was putting the pieces together. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something like excitement in his old eyes.
He took a pencil and a ruler. He laid the ruler on the old map, aligning it with the property lines. He made a few quick calculations, scribbling on a notepad. He checked them twice. He put the pencil down. "Your sketch is crude," he said, his voice flat. "But your cows are smarter than I am." He pointed to his calculations. "If your posts are where you say they are, and that corner is where you say it is, you haven't got 80 acres fenced. You've got 81 and a half. And the piece that's on the other side of your phantom fence, that's 40.2 acres. He paused, letting the number sink in. 40.2 acres of what was probably the best soil in the whole section. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Substantial," he said. One word, no fanfare, no exclamation, just a single restrained, deeply satisfying word.
Substantial. He told me what I'd need to do. Hire a licensed surveyor, he gave me a name, to come out and shoot the line, find the original pin if possible, or set a new one based on a 1928 plat. File a corrected survey with the county. It would cost a little money, but it would be official. It would be real. I rolled up my sketch and thanked him. As I was leaving, he said, "Reynolds," I turned. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said. "You tell him he was right." I just nodded. I didn't have the heart to tell him he was about 40 years too late. The vindication wasn't a single moment, it was a season of hard work. The surveyor Mr. Abernathy recommended came out the next spring. He was a young man with a GPS rover and a drone, the polar opposite of Abernathy, but he was good. He used my line of rotted posts in the Belties trail as his guide. After 2 days of cutting through brush and fighting mosquitoes, he found it, the original 1928 iron pin. It was buried 2 feet down, in the silted-up creek bed, right where Abernathy said it would be, right where the cattle had made their 90-degree turn. The surveyor called it exceptional. The official survey confirmed it, 40.7 acres of forgotten land. My land. Once the survey was filed, the real work began. I rented a heavy-duty brush hog, the kind you pull behind a big tractor. For a solid month, I did nothing but grind cedar trees and sumac into mulch. It was slow, noisy, dusty work. Day after day, I'd watch as more and more of the black ground was revealed. With every pass of the mower, the world got a little bigger. The cattle watched me from the safety of the woods. They had done their job. Now it was my turn. By the time I was finished, the change was staggering. Where there had been an impenetrable wall of brush, there was now a wide, open expanse of land. It rolled gently down from the upland pasture and settled into a rich, flat bottom that followed the old, forgotten curve of the creek. The soil was just as the probe had promised, black, deep, and fertile. I hadn't just found more land, I'd found the best land. That summer, I didn't plow it. It didn't need it. I broadcast a simple mix of clover and orchard grass, and the land took it like a thirsty man takes water. The rains came at the right time, and by July, the new 40 acres were covered in a lush, green carpet that was almost shocking in its vibrancy. The numbers, the ones the extension agent had been so sure of, started to look very different. My north quarter was no longer 80 usable acres. It was 120. The carrying capacity wasn't 50 cows for 45 days. With the new pasture, managed properly, I could run those 50 Belties year-round with minimal hay in the dead of winter. The $15,000 liability had turned into a self-sustaining, profitable herd. But the real value was in the land itself. Good bottomland pasture in our county was going for $3,000 an acre at the time, if you could find it. I hadn't just saved myself $15,000 in hay. I had uncovered an asset worth over $120,000. An asset that had been there all along, waiting. It had been paid for by my great-grandfather a century ago. All it had cost me was the price of some cull cows and the patience to listen. The Belties, of course, were the true victors. When I finally opened the gap to the new pasture, they walked onto it with that same calm, deliberate manner they had on the day they arrived. This was the place they had been looking for all along. They spread out across the clover, and for the first time since they'd arrived, I heard a sound from them that wasn't just a low murmur. It was a soft, contented bellow, a sound of arrival.
They spent the rest of the summer on that new ground, and by fall they were fat. Not just feedlot fat, but a deep, healthy, grass-fed fat. Their coats shone. They were no longer just a rugged novelty breed. They were magnificent. They had reclaimed their pasture, and it had, in turn, transformed them. I learned something important that summer. The modern expert, with his clipboard and his certainties, hadn't been wrong about the numbers. He was just using the wrong map. He had calculated the assets I had, but he had failed to account for the assets I might find. He saw a problem to be managed. My grandfather and the cattle saw a story to be uncovered. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. That fall I sold 30 of the young stock. I didn't take them to the local sale barn. I called a processor who supplied high-end restaurants in the city.
He came out, looked at the animals, saw the pasture they were on, and he went quiet. He walked out into the clover, knelt down and looked at the forage. He watched the cattle graze. He came back to the truck. Exceptional, he said. Another quiet expert, another single, validating word. I got a premium price for them, more than double what I would have gotten for a commodity steer. The check was enough to pay for the surveying, the clearing and the seed, with plenty left over. It was the first time the North Quarter had turned a profit in my lifetime. The vindication was quiet and it was complete. It was the next summer, a hot afternoon in late August. The air was thick and heavy and the corn in the bottom fields was starting to fire at the bottom, a sign it was getting dry. I was out fixing the fence on the new pasture, not because the cows were testing it, but just because a fence needs tending. I heard a truck slow down on the county road and pull over. I knew the sound of that diesel engine. It was Dale. His new Ram, still gleaming, idled by the gate. The window came down with a soft electric hum. He sat there for a moment, just looking. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking past me, at the 40 acres of lush green clover dotted with 50 black and white cows. He was looking at the new fence, the straight lines and the tight wires. He was looking at land he had last seen as an impenetrable thicket. For a full minute, he didn't say anything. He just took it all in. The scale of the change, the sheer undeniable fact of it. In his world of spreadsheets and certainties, this wasn't supposed to be possible. Land didn't just appear. Profit didn't come from sentiment and scrub cattle. Yet, there it was. "Afternoon," I said, breaking the silence. I walked over to the truck, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. He finally turned his head and looked at me. The confident, knowing smile he usually wore was gone. In its place was a look of grudging respect, mixed with a confusion he was trying hard to hide. "Reynolds," he said, nodding. He gestured with his chin, the same gesture as before, but the meaning had changed entirely. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It was inquisitive. "Looks like you found some more ground," he said. His voice was flat, an admission of fact, not a question. "It was here all along," I said. "Just had to clear some brush." He grunted a non-committal sound. He looked back at the cattle who were grazing peacefully, their heads down. "Those cows," he said, and then he stopped. He was searching for the right words, for a way to acknowledge what had happened without admitting how wrong he had been. "They did more than I thought they would," he finally managed. That was it. That was the whole concession. No apology, no questions about how I'd found it, no admission that his numbers and his certainty had been completely, fundamentally wrong. Just a plain, understated acknowledgement that something had occurred which his worldview could not easily explain. And in our part of the country, among men like us, that was more than enough. It was a white flag, delivered without ceremony. It was the quiet concession, the only kind of victory lap that matters. "They pay attention," I said. He nodded slowly, still looking at the pasture. "Seems so," he said. He put the truck in gear. "Well, keep at it." The window hummed back up, sealing him back inside his air-conditioned world of certainties. He pulled back onto the road and drove off, a little slower than usual. I watched him go, and I felt no sense of triumph, no desire to gloat. He was a good farmer by his own lights, and his way worked for him, but his map was too new. It didn't have the old roads on it. I went back to my fence. The sun was hot on my back. A few of the Belties had wandered over, curious, and were watching me with their dark, placid eyes. I looked at them, and then out at the expanse of green they had uncovered. My grandfather had been right. Dale had been right too, in a way. The numbers hadn't worked, but the story had. And sometimes the story is the only thing that's real. The rest is just noise. The quiet hum of Dale's truck faded into the distance, leaving just the sound of the wind in the grass and the steady, patient rhythm of grazing. I still own those 50 acres of upland scrub. I keep it for the deer and the turkey. But the heart of the North Quarter is that 40 acres of black ground now. It's the engine of the farm in a way the row crops never were. It's a closed loop. The cattle feed the soil feeds the grass, and the grass feeds the cattle. It asks very little of me but my attention. I think about that a lot, standing on the rise where my grandfather stood, looking out over the whole 120 acres. I think about the layers of knowledge that live in a place.
There's the knowledge of the deed and the survey map, the official lines drawn by men. Then there's the knowledge of memory, the stories passed down, the questions left in old notebooks. And underneath all of that, there's the oldest knowledge of all, the knowledge of the land itself, the deep, slow memory of the soil and the water. And the animals, they live there. They walk on that old map every day. They don't have spreadsheets or deeds. They have instinct and hunger and an unbroken connection to the way things are. We get in a hurry. We think we're smarter than the generations that came before because we have better machines and more data. We look at a piece of ground and see what it is today, and we project that into the future. We forget to ask what it used to be. We forget that what's forgotten ain't gone. It's just waiting. It's waiting for a fence to fall, for the brush to grow, for a generation to pass.
And then it's waiting for someone to come along who has the patience to listen, who's willing to trust a cryptic note from a dead man and the instincts of a hungry cow. It's waiting for someone to believe that there's more to the world than what we can easily see and measure. That 40 acres taught me a lesson that I'll carry with me for the rest of my days. It taught me that the most valuable things are often the things we've overlooked. The hidden pasture, the dismissed animal, the forgotten wisdom in a dusty book. True wealth isn't always about the clever new thing. Sometimes it's about having the grace to rediscover the old one. If you've got your own piece of forgotten ground, an old tool from your grandfather that knows more than you do, or a cryptic note in a family Bible, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what secrets you've uncovered by moving slow and paying attention. And subscribe if this meant something to you. There are more stories here, waiting to be told.